Good evening, everyone. Before we move into tonight's discussion, I'd like to introduce Huar Nassim, Acting Consul General of Canada in New York, who will present some brief welcome remarks. Consul General Nassim was previously Canada's Consul General of Minneapolis, and he is a career diplomat with a distinguished profile. Huar, welcome.
Okay, I think I got it. I think I got it. Thank you very much. Always a risk whenever I get called upon to make sure everything's unmuted and things. So thanks, Lauren, and good evening. As Lauren mentioned, I'm Huar Nassim. I'm based in New York, but our mission serves Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Delaware, and of course includes the greater Philadelphia region, where we are represented mightily by the lovely and talented Joshua Dillard. Thanks for all of you for joining us tonight. I look forward to what should be a fascinating discussion with the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia and our Defense Attaché in Washington, Major General Paul Ormsby. So, the coronavirus has upended all of our lives, but we're resilient and we're committed. And that is why I fumble through mutes and different technologies and videos and on a daily basis. And I just hope that I'm not delivering this speech as a cat. For those of you who have seen the video, I'm sure you'll get a chuckle out of that one. I've traveled to the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, as Mayor Kenny let me know, on a number of occasions during my tenure. And what I can tell you is that every time I visit, I come away with the desire to do more with Philadelphia. It really is inspiring. It's one of the most vibrant and dynamic cities in the United States. And I always feel like there's so much more that we can do. It kind of brings us to tonight's event, which is really our testament on our behalf to do more and keep a good thing going with Philadelphia. Usually, when I come to Philadelphia, I tout the underappreciated business, education, and cultural links that Canada shares with the region. On the business side, Philadelphia-based companies like Aramark, Crown Holdings, and Sandmeyer Steel, they do great business in Canada. And Canada and Philadelphia share cultural ties as well. In the fall of last year, pre-COVID, I visited Philadelphia for Ballet Jazz de Montréal, who performed a program inspired by one of my favorite artists, a Montreal native, Leonard Cohen, at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Center. It was a true highlight for me, and the audience in the room, which included the mayor, just gave him a standing ovation. We also have our Quebec's own Yannick Nézet-Séguin, who continues his tremendous work as the director of the Philadelphia Orchestra. I got to regress a little bit because I can talk about culture, but I'm really a sports guy. And so when I heard the topic for tonight and they said Canada, Philadelphia, and defense, I regressed to my childhood and my idolization of Bobby Clark and the Broad Street Bullies. I may be dating myself a little bit, but when I think of Canada, Philadelphia, and defense, I think of Bobby Clark, Bernie Perron, Ed Van Impe, who laid the defensive foundations to propel the Flyers to back-to-back Stanley Cups. It was a tremendous era, and I hope Claude Giroux can do the same for you going forward. Hockey aside, and it's a difficult aside because I really do like hockey, the Canada-US Defense Partnership is really forged on the basis of shared geography, common values, and historical connections. Essentially, we see things the same way. From joint training exercises to personnel exchanges, including right here in Philadelphia at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which I visited last year, our countries share a collaborative and common approach to defense. Your bad guys are our bad guys too. So, tonight's discussion with Major General Paul Ormsby will explore this relationship in depth, and I look forward to hearing from him, but also from all of you. I look forward to the questions, I look forward to the discussion, but for now, I'm going to turn it back to a good friend of mine and a good friend of the consulate. You're so lucky to have her, Lauren Schwartz. Lauren, you've been a tremendous supporter of the relationship. I'm grateful to see you, and I look forward to doing it in person. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Huar. And I was taking notes on when we would start to talk about hockey, and we got it in the first 5 minutes. So the field is open, or the rink is open, I should say, for more hockey metaphors. No pressure, Major General. We love hockey almost as much as Canadians do here in Philly. We do appreciate you all being with us tonight. And before I joined the World Affairs Council in September, I spent the past 15 years working to strengthen trade and investment ties to Canada and in the US. And we know that Canada has invested deeply in our region for some of the examples that Hwar just gave us in opening a trade office here, bringing companies here, culture, arts, sports, business, and defense partnerships as well. And people across the Philadelphia region, I think across the US, sometimes forget almost that Canada is more than a friend. It's also another country. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight, the complexities and strength and depth of this relationship. And it's something that Philadelphia holds dear to its heart as well. When Mayor Kenney took his first international trip when he was elected to office in his first term, the first place he went is Canada. And he's been back since. And that's a testament to how our city views this multifaceted relationship. And even the youngest Philadelphians are fans of Canada too, not just because of hockey, but the Canadians have come down and started doing their maple candy, where they put boiling hot maple syrup in the snow at our Christmas village every year, which I know my kids love. And now is a reason many of the young folks say, I really want to go to Canada. And then they'll learn all of the other aspects of our relationship. And speaking of young people, I'd like to offer a warm welcome to all of the high school students and middle school students, college students, and teachers who are here with us tonight and who participate in the World Affairs Council's education programs throughout the year. We work with over 2,500 students in 85 schools to be the World Affairs education provider for our region. And it's wonderful that we have an opportunity to expose them to conversations like tonight and to get to meet you, Major General. And for over 70 years, the Council has provided platforms like this for fresh perspectives and nonpartisan civil discourse on critical issues affecting the world. We won't fight here tonight or argue, but we'll present ideas and topics and discuss them. And the audience can ask you questions in a more intimate, albeit reluctantly virtual setting. Although we do look forward to seeing everyone in person as soon as we can. And if you would like to send questions for our speaker, you can do so at any time, which we'll answer later in the webinar. Please just use the questions function in your Zoom application, and we'll get to as many of the audience questions as we can. And now I'd like to briefly introduce tonight's guest. We are so delighted and honored to have Major General Paul Ormsby with us, who is currently serving as the Canadian Defense Attaché to the United States. Major General Ormsby is an Air Combat Systems officer with extensive operational and flight test experience. From 2016 to 2017, he was the Deputy Commander for the Continental United States NORAD region. And in 2011, he led Canada's Task Force Naples during Operation Unified Protector, enforcing UN security resolutions regarding Libya. If you'd like to learn more about Major General Ormsby's background, which is quite impressive, you can find his bio on our website. And now we'll start with some brief opening remarks from the Major General before we turn to our moderated discussion, followed by your questions. Major General, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Lauren, for that introduction, and thank you for the kind invitation to be here. And especially, I want to say also welcome to the students out of here. I think it's marvelous that your organization has this outreach at these levels, and I think the kind of social global awareness that you're building in such a young population is absolutely wonderful, and can only pay dividends, certainly for American society and certainly for those that will come in contact with these young individuals in the future. Also to our Consul General and our team from New York and Philadelphia, thank you for assisting in this. I really appreciate it. It's a great honor again to be a part of this, and I hope I can provide a little bit of value in terms of contributing to the discussion and the questions you may have about Canada and our relationship from a defense and a security perspective. I know there are a lot of topics we want to cover tonight, but if I could just open by making a few remarks. Many people don't realize how many Canadian military personnel are actually in the United States. At any one time, we have about 700 uniformed personnel working with your American colleagues side by side in the United States. The vast majority of those people are embedded in US military units, commands, or organization. Our largest contribution is actually to NORAD, which we probably will be speaking about in a bit more detail but the North American Aerospace Defense Command. We have about 350 personnel spread across the United States, from Alaska to Florida, and of course Colorado Springs, working in that organization. The other 400 approximately are in 33 of the 50 states of the United States, and certainly in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, not only at the War College, but we also have people at the Boeing manufacturing facility where helicopters we purchased or produced, and various outfits and organizations like that. So my job as a defense attaché is to ensure that they have what they need to do their job to contribute to defense of Canada and the United States collectively, and to support their families, because with their families, we have about 2,000 Canadians in the United States who are doing defense jobs. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I personally am on my fourth tour in the United States, having served previously, as Lauren mentioned, certainly in Florida at NORAD, but a couple of other positions as well. And I'm very glad to be back, and I'm honored to be here this evening. So I look forward to the questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. And I do have a few notes with me for some facts and figures. So if you see me looking down, I'm just checking the data to make sure I don't get it wrong. It's not because I've lost interest. So, Lauren, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Major General. So we'll get started, and we'll start with the current events, right? Our new presidential administration and Canadian-American relationships. We know that a president's first phone call to a foreign leader often signals the focus of a new administration's policy. And we know the world is waiting and watching what Biden is doing in terms of foreign policy and what shifts we'll see and what things he might hold steady. President Biden's first call was to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on January 22nd, right after inauguration. Some argue that he chose to make this first call to help reinforce this really crucial relationship between Canada and the US. Others purport that the call was a consolation following President Biden's swift action to revoke the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. Perhaps it was a bit of both. Often the truth is somewhere in the middle. But we'd love to get your take on this first call. What signals do you think are the loudest from this first phone call in particular? And how does that, what areas of that impact your strategy on the defense relationship side?
Well, thanks for the question. Yes, we were delighted that President Biden contacted our Prime Minister as the first national leader, global leader, to make contact. And certainly as Canadians, that just reinforced the message our Consul General was just making a few moments ago, that American interests and Canadian interests are very much aligned. And not just in the areas of security and defense, but the environment, which I know the two leaders spoke about, economic development, and of course, how to deal with COVID, which is the most current event that we're dealing with. So it's not a surprise to many Canadians that the first call would be to our Prime Minister, because frankly, there's a lot of work to do that we need to do together as countries. And if I could just touch on that defense aspect, as you mentioned, quite clearly in the readout from the call, there was talk about NORAD modernization and the need to improve continental defense in general. And in fact, both leaders agreed that the Secretary of State should meet with our Minister of Global Affairs, which is our Foreign Affairs Ministry, and that our Minister of Defense should meet with the Secretary of Defense as soon as practical. So plans are underway to make those happen, and I think those will be happening in the near future. As I said, there is a lot that needs to be hammered out because the world is changing. If we look at the world on a spectrum of safety, security, and defense, certainly in the security and defense space where we operate and the United States Department of Defense operates, there's a lot to be done to deal with changing threats in the world. Everything that you heard about in the news, from cyber to artificial intelligence to hacking to nations developing new capabilities that we have to be sure that we can protect ourselves from. So I was very happy with the call. I was very happy to see when it happened and what the nature of the discussion was. Yes, you're right. Keystone XL pipeline was discussed, and certainly amongst all these other things. And I think certainly, it was a disappointment to Canada, the decision that was made, and the Prime Minister expressed that and publicly stated that. But I think in that context, it's important to keep in mind that two advanced and sophisticated countries, and frankly, friends, as we are and allies, one event like that doesn't make or break a relationship. There are lots of things that leaders have to determine that they will pursue or not pursue, and for many reasons. And we understand that. We certainly had a particular view on it, and President Biden had his particular view on it. But on that note, if I could, it's just we're talking about energy. I did a little research because I thought this subject might come up today. And I just want to check my notes so I don't miss it. But I was fascinated to find out that in terms of pipelines, there are over 70 pipelines already between Canada and the United States. In addition, there are over 30 major electricity transmission lines between Canada and the United States that flows electricity back and forth. We supply more oil to the United States than all OPEC countries combined. It's that significant in terms of what we do. We also provide 1/3 of the uranium that's used for nuclear reactors that produces 20% of the energy used by American nuclear reactors to provide to the American people. And I only mention these points just to build on what our Consul General was saying, that we're so integrated as countries on this continent, from an economic perspective, from our hydroelectric grid, to our desire for clean energy in the future. And I know that's a discussion that the governments are also having as well. The environment is very keenly listed as the priorities for both governments. So anyway, just to summarize on that, very happy with that phone call. From a defense perspective, it gives us a clear indication of what the leaders are thinking. And now it's up to us to roll up our sleeves and do some of the work that's needed.
Indeed, a lot of work to come, and it's we've got those next meetings set up. We'll all be anxious to see what the priorities are set between our two countries and how we work together in different ways. As you said, everything is changing right now, so we have to take a fresh look. And but let's switch gears. Let's look a bit towards the past as well. You've been in roles like this and influential in these types of relationships for a long time, and we'd love to hear from you about how our two countries have sought to grow and strengthen one another throughout history, and perhaps where have we faltered? I do realize that this is quite a big question. Can you give us the Cliff's Note version of the Canadian-U.S. defense relationship in a few minutes? But I do think it will help our audience understand the present day challenges through the lens of a historic defense relationship between Canada and the U.S. What are the high points and what are the things you want our audience to know and remember?
Absolutely, sure. So I would say the high points are certainly where we are today. But if I could go back to answer the nexus of your question, it wasn't always that way. Certainly when Canada was not a country, when it was a series of colonies, British colonies, just as the American 13 colonies were, there was a lot of friction. In fact, one of the first battles of the American Civil War was actually in Montreal, and led by an American general named Benedict Arnold. And so there was we've had a history, a sort of a checkered history in the 17th and 18th century, or 18th and 19th centuries, in terms of these relationships, including the War of 1812, the Fenian raids, where American armies twice invaded Canada, etc. For us, that's long in the past. Since Canada became its own sovereign country in 1867, we've certainly had nothing but a positive and strong relationship with the United States. And I think historically, if you look back at where it probably gained the most energy was World War II, because we were so involved for so long with each other. And the North American continent was for the first time really at threat. So back in 1941, the United States government, the Canadian government, formed something called the Permanent Joint Board on Defense. That board still exists today, and it meets a minimum of twice a year, and it's led by senior officials, elected officials, who provide guidance to both departments in Canada and the United States as to what they wish to achieve and areas that they wish to investigate for further work and further cooperation. So that's just one of many of the long-standing organizations and, frankly, treaties that we have with the United States. Shortly after that was formed, I think the most outstanding demonstration or example of our cooperation together, and it was a real highlight when it was formed, and it's still today, is NORAD. It is the only, what we call a binational command in the world. So no country, no one country owns that organization. Both countries own it equally. So there's no lead nation and there's no support or following nation. Both countries put people into it. Both countries have an equal say as to what NORAD will do, how it will operate. And that has continued on for almost 70 years since the founding of NORAD. So it's a unique organization. You will not find another one like it anywhere in the world. And it's because we share this continent together. It's because we have to defend this continent together. It's too much for one nation to do alone. So we need our cooperation in order to do that. So NORAD has never faltered. In fact, on 9/11, the commander of NORAD, who's typically an American in Colorado Springs, was not in Colorado Springs. So his deputy commander was Canadian. He had the watch that day. The continental NORAD region, which is controlling the lower 48 states, overseeing it and protecting it, is run out of Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. The Canadian deputy commander had the watch that day as well. So Canadians were on the watch when these terrible events happened. But I'm not saying that just to simply say, hey, that's a Canadian thing. Not at all. It was something that we practiced and we worked on for decades, and the system works. So I think that's a tremendous example of the cooperation. Less than a month after September 11th, our military was in Afghanistan with your military. It's not well known. Some of the operations there at the time were Special Forces operations, but we served alongside U.S. forces in Afghanistan for over a decade. We're very interested in the outcome in Afghanistan, just as we are in Iraq, and we continue to support the mission in Iraq as well, with over 200 of our people in Iraq. We haven't always seen eye to eye on foreign policy. I mean, we are a sovereign nation, and we have a different view from time to time from the United States. For example, in 2003, Canada did not participate in the operations against Iraq when the United States and some other allies did. Those were for reasons that the Canadian government explained at that time. But that didn't break our relationship. That didn't break the friendship. Just sometimes friends don't agree. Allies don't agree on the way ahead. And that was one example. So, but the fact that I'm here today in Washington, in fact, we have 700 Canadian military in the United States, and we have a similar number of Americans in Canada still cooperating today. I think shows that the history was strong enough and the relationship was strong enough to get us through even the rough patches. And so now we have to look forward, and we have a lot ahead of us. So the past is going to get us there into the future.
Indeed, a lot to look forward to, and a very complex virtual in this regard, but virtual in terms of cybersecurity threats and borderless threats and stateless enemies. It's quite a lot to handle.
Certainly.
So continuing on the concept of mutual defense and NATO and NORAD, we do share these defense commitments together, and our militaries cooperate continentally, as we discussed with NORAD, and in many other ways, some that are well known, some that are lesser known. But we know, again, that defense will look different in the future than in the past. So can you talk a little bit more about how these defense commitments, like NATO and NORAD, and the continued modernization of these commitments and investments we make in them, will help the US and Canada to adapt to new threats and challenges as we head deeper into 21st century world's 21st century technologies and threats?
Absolutely. Honestly, we have no choice but to adapt. I think we all were hoping when the Berlin Wall came down and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a moment where it would herald a new era of peace and stability, and we just haven't seen that. We've seen the rise now of national actors, certainly Russia. Russia, I think, is it's still a superpower in that it has nuclear weapons in that respect. It's a country with declining a population, a declining economy, yet it's still an actor on the world stage. The question is it still relevant as an actor? I think it's searching for some relevance, to be honest. China is a relevant actor on the stage. Its population is greater than ours combined. Our two countries, its economy is growing rapidly and probably will exceed. So it's a nation that we have to coexist with, and yet we have tensions at the moment. So how do we as Canadians and Americans, how do we deal with that? How do we assure our own security and our own stability and our own defense? Certainly as Canadians, our expression of military strength is through NATO. It's the most successful military alliance the world has ever seen. It has enough mass in terms of the number of nations and the amount of capability it has to have the deterrent effect that we need. And our strategy essentially is deterrence. We want to signal to any opponent that the cost of striking us or striking out against us is so expensive in many ways that it is not worth the opportunity cost to you. So the only way you can do that is to be able to identify and detect these threats, whatever they may be, in whatever dimension or domain they may be. The ability to deny the enemy the use of these threatening tools, and then when necessary to be able to defeat them. And I say that because for us, our thinking now is with the changes that you talked about, Lauren, AI, cyber, the hacking threat, persistent hacking threat, the stealing of industrial secrets to where we lose the technical advantage. How do we defeat these, or how do we demonstrate we can defeat them in order to deter someone from taking action against us? And this is where I think the collective minds of the Western Alliance need to work and are working together to make sure that we are able to do this. At the same time, there's never a final word in diplomacy. Diplomacy has to continue. If there's ever a final word in diplomacy, there will never be a final word in war. And we're trying to prevent that. So the diplomacy has to follow through. It has to do its play its role in easing tensions and finding stability so that we can coexist. I think, countries like China are here to stay. Russia is here to stay. Many nations are looking to develop and be players on the world, and we have to learn to live together. So I think all these things have to come together. Certainly, if I could just sort of focus down a little bit to NORAD, this is our home, right? This continent is our home. We live here together. And we're certainly looking at what the threats are today that an enemy or an opposition or a competitor even might use to hold what we value at risk, whether it's our infrastructure, whether it's our political leadership, whether it's our institutions. So there are things that you may have seen in the press that are out there, like hypersonic vehicles, high-speed vehicles that evade detection, cruise missiles, advanced cruise missiles that are difficult to detect, and so on. So this is where we're looking right now, and this is where our science and technology research is looking right now to for the home game as much as anything else to make sure that we can defend ourselves. Hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely. A lot more questions are coming out of it. I'm scribbling them down, but I won't. We'll move on to the next topic because we have quite a few things that we'd like to cover. I'd like to talk a little bit about our relations with the Arctic. Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework outlines the need for a policy towards resource regulation and how best to clearly define the boundaries in the Arctic, among other key areas for the region. Two present challenges in this part of the world are climate change and Russian provocation. You just mentioned Russia, and so we'll focus in on that in this particular part of our planet. What needs must be met to ensure security in this part of the world? And how can the US and Canada cooperate to work in the Arctic and secure safety and peace and resource preservation going forward?
So this is certainly a lot of brain power is being spent thinking about this now. And certainly there have been people that have been warning us for decades that this was going to be an issue that needed to be addressed quickly. There's the environmental aspect, there's the political aspect, there's the security aspect in the Arctic. If I could just talk about the security aspect to start with, I mean, if you were to take a circumpolar map of the Arctic and look straight down on the North Pole, Russia certainly occupies a huge amount of the territory in the Arctic, and it will have its own national needs and desires. I mean, there are ports and towns, they need resupplying, and there's a transportation route that goes from Europe to Asia via the northern route. So clearly the Russians are going to be there. They're going to be breaking ice. They're going to be having shipping and fishing and exploitation, which always follows exploration in terms of oil and mineral rights. But if you also look at that same map, you have a lot of countries there that we all know, and most of them are NATO allies. The United States is Canada's western partner in the Arctic. Denmark is to the east. And you go around, obviously, to the Scandinavian countries as well, some of whom are NATO members, and some are not. So I think in any theater, we're looking for stability. We're looking for lack of provocation in the areas that we see them. And so how do you do that? What are the issues that are causing the friction in the Arctic at the moment? You certainly talked about political boundaries. Canada has made a claim up to the North Pole regarding the underwater mineral rights and sovereign territory. I have to say I'm not an expert in this, so I don't want to get too deep into it because I don't want to mislead anybody if I get the facts wrong. But we've made that claim to the World Court, and the Russians have made the same claim. So right there's a friction point as to who has the access rights to the minerals that are on the seabed in the Arctic. These things need to be resolved, because if they can be resolved peacefully and diplomatically, the chance of any offensive encounter is going to go right down to zero. And this always has to be the aim that we're shooting for. But in the meantime, until that can be done, as I mentioned earlier regarding NORAD, we have to be able to demonstrate presence. We believe it's our territory, so we have to be there. Doesn't mean we're going to be there all the time. It's a great distance from southern Canada, where most Canadians live, but we have to have the ability to react and to deploy our forces and certainly to survey the area so that we are constantly aware of what's going on in the Arctic. And we have a very large project with the United States to cooperate on technologies to allow us to do that, which I can't go into here, but it's been ongoing for some time. So I think that's the other part of the key. So, resolve the political issues, resolve the economic issues, and in the meantime, still demonstrate that you're able to defend your interests, but you believe in your sovereign interests, including your territory, and to defend your people. I would say I don't want to paint too negative a picture of the Arctic. It's certainly a theater of operations for us in the military, as any area might be. There's also a lot of good going on in the Arctic. Canada and the United States are part of the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council is everything except military. So it deals with a lot of things. There was a wonderful search and rescue treaty that was signed by all the Arctic Council nations, including Russia, where we cooperate should a ship be adrift in the Arctic. As we saw, a cruise ship a number of years ago lost power and was drifting around the Arctic, that sort of thing. So, there are venues in which to engage partner nations too, to make sure we are cooperating and that they see the benefits of this cooperation, so that we don't continually have a series of frictions that lead us to conflict. Which this is not what we're trying to achieve. This is what we're trying to avoid. I think I want to make sure I answered your question. Anything else on that?
I think that's a good start. We've got some audience questions coming in for follow-up.
All right.
And let's continue the talk on borders, but look south back to the American and Canadian border, and also in the context of the immense challenges that we're all facing because of COVID-19. We know that national security is often intertwined with countries' strategies to combat complex domestic issues and worldwide obstacles, certainly like a pandemic. And the border between our two countries is the longest international border in the world, with over 120 land ports of entry alone. This poses quite a risk to national security. If we were feeling like there's security threats between the US and Canada, most of us walk around thinking it's fine and no big deal. But of course, the border has been intermittently closed and faced continual extensions of this closure on a month-to-month basis, which feels very strange to people who live near the border and who do business cross-border, have family cross-border. It's something people never anticipated or really even ever planned for. And while that border will potentially be reopened later this month, there will be likely continued restrictions in various capacities, of course, because the pandemic is not yet under control. Having said all of that, what do you think is the best path forward for our two nations to maintain a strong relationship, but also facing the risks posed by the pandemic for things like non-essential travel across our shared border? How long can we sustain this closed border and maintain our relationship?
Yeah, it's listen, I won't pretend this is easy on anybody. We I meet Americans all the time here where I happen to live. I'm in Northern Virginia, Alexandria, just outside of BC. And many Americans, I'm always surprised by how many connections Americans have to Canada. And they want to go see cousins, or they want to go and visit. Many of them actually have property in Canada. They own cottages or lake houses, and many of them operate businesses where they take American, say, hunters or people who want to go fishing. They take them to lodges that they own in Canada, and that business has been restricted, as it has been in the other direction, where Canadians are trying to do the same thing. I think the reality is the number one priority that both countries have to do is get the pandemic under control. If we can get the pandemic under control, we can move towards more economic interaction in this regard. On an average day prior to the pandemic, 400,000 people crossed the border every day between Canada and the United States. That is a huge number of people. That number has gone way down. It's about 10% of that, so about 40,000 a day, based on the latest figures that I was given this morning. About 80% of those are truckers. So they are moving commerce, they are moving goods every day back and forth between Canada and the United States. So that vital economic flow is still happening. Goods are being processed, goods are traveling, duties are being paid, and they're getting to the factories that need to do what they need to do. Essential workers are still traveling over. Many Canadians who live in border cities work in American hospitals, nurses specifically. So they drive over every day from Windsor, for instance, into Detroit, and that's still allowed, and vice versa for Americans maybe working in American or Canadian medical clinics. That's just one example. So it's not like it's been completely shut down. It's been reduced for the right reasons, and it's similar. Actually, I don't want to use a false comparison here, but if the border were to be open at this time, prior to pandemic really being under control, we risk losing the gains we've made in trying to control it. I think that's the perspective both governments have taken. And I can tell you that the decision on the border opening or closing, it's taken by the governments together. They consult all the time. I see it in the embassy. Our ambassador is very involved in these discussions, and it's a mutual decision. So both governments feel this is the right decision, and perhaps, I don't know, but the more we can stick to the plan, the more we can limit all travel, the more we can get vaccinated, the more we can do our part by wearing a mask, the more the government provides assistance to the economy while we're in this holding pattern, the faster we can get through all this and return to normal. That's what we're trying to achieve. So what do I think this is the right plan? Yes, I do. We don't have an alternative that works. I think we would be doing it. Our hope is in the vaccine, and once that happens and we get the immunity we need as communities, we'll be faster on the track back.
All right. More to come. I know the 400,000 people who cross daily are hanging on your every word and eager for things to ease for the sake of the pandemic and for our bilateral relations and going to see grandma and hockey games and all the things.
Yes.
Let's switch gears here. Last week, Canada became the first nation to formally designate the Proud Boys as a terrorist group. And while that designation doesn't necessarily mean that there will be immediate arrests of group members or in the short term, we'd like to ask you, how does designating this group and other far-right or neo-Nazi groups like it help national security? An example that we'd like to draw upon, or maybe you could share comments on about what could have been different, is in 2017, when 5 members of the Canadian Armed Forces, who also identified themselves as Proud Boys, disrupted and disputed an Indigenous ceremony in Halifax, Nova Scotia. If the Proud Boys had been then designated as a terrorist group, how would the situation have played out differently? And what do you see the future?
So I have to tell you, I remember when the incident in 2017 happened, and it came to the attention of our chief of defense staff at the time. And I think it was the event took place on a weekend, and I attend a meeting every Tuesday where I sit in on a video conference. The chief of defense gets updated on issues, and this issue was brought up, and he was aware of it already, obviously. But we all sort of had this discussion, like, well, who are the Proud Boys? Where'd they come from? It was certainly most of us at the table. I think some people from the intelligence community probably knew a bit more about it than we did um, at the time, but certainly that didn't escape the attention of us. And we subsequently released not only policies regarding racism, but what we call hateful conduct. So there is a policy that prohibits hateful conduct. It's a discipline, it's an event, or sorry, it's an action which can result in discipline and dismissal from the Canadian Armed Forces. And hateful conduct is defined as racist behavior, and that means everything from white supremacy to any other hateful ideology. It's simply not acceptable to Canadian Armed Forces, and here's the reason why. We have to be credible. We have to be credible in the eyes of Canadians. All Canadians have to have the belief that their military is there for them and will defend all of them, not just select individuals, not just to benefit select individuals that have a particular ideology. And not only that, our military has to defend our way of life. And if you've been to Canada, you know that we have a very multicultural society. I grew up in Toronto, and I remember when I was in university, the United Nations identified Toronto as the most multicultural city on the earth, given the number of languages that are spoken there, the number of significant ethnic cultures that were there in terms of sizes of population. So when those people see members of a hate group like the Proud Boys in the military, they're not going to stand for it. And therefore, it's up to us to make sure this never happens, because we're there for all Canadians. I can tell you, my wife is not white, and I know that she wants to make sure that everybody in the military is there to defend her as much as they are to defend me. And she has that right and expectation, and she's absolutely correct in that. So if we also want to be a long-lasting and credible institution in the eyes of Canadians, we have to, I know it's cliche, but we have to reflect Canada and frankly, the values of Canada, which is inclusiveness. So had these laws been in, or these measures been in place in 2017, maybe we would have taken action a bit sooner, but I can tell you some of those members were actually released from the military in that 2017 incident. Interestingly, I heard yesterday a spokesman for your Department of Defense talking about this, and it was on NPR, and they were talking about the Proud Boys. And the spokesman was saying, under American law, it's a little different. You can actually be a member of certain groups because it's a constitutional right, but you cross the line when you take specific actions identified with that group. And they admitted it's a struggle. They're trying to deal with this idea of how much do you permit in which way. And honestly, we're struggling legally in some of those areas too, because we want to not deny rights where they shouldn't be denied. On the other hand, some things are crossing the line, and certainly the Proud Boys is an example of that.
I know, of course, it made big news here when Canada made that declaration, and it put a lot of pressure on American leaders and the military to look inward and to discuss publicly some of these same struggles, but without the, of course, same resolution here in the U.S. at this time. So we're watching yes. Our neighbors to the north.
Well, I heard, and I'm not 100% sure, but apparently the Proud Boys was started by a Canadian. So certainly that struck close to home for those of us that heard that fact.
Yes, that's what's out there on the internet. Excuse me, on the internet, yeah. And whether that's true or not, we'll see. Yeah. But that seems to be the rumor, which also is a big surprise, I think, to most Americans, that we share some of these same issues, and maybe we can share solutions. And so Go ahead.
Because I don't believe Americans in any way would say those are our values. You know, what these groups represent. They don't.
Let's move over to China now. It's been over 2 years since Canadians Michael Carvig and Michael Spavor were detained in China, which has been widely regarded as retaliation against the arrest of Huawei Chief Financial Officer Meng Wanzhou by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on an extradition warrant from the United States. This has put a lot of tension, of course, on the Canada-US-China relationship and all triangulations of those three countries. Some seeing it as Canada's doing the US's bidding against China, and they're frustrated by that. The Americans, some seeing Canada helping the US, and they're proud of that. There's many different views on this. However, this is not the only issue among the three countries, right? The US and Canada both share concerns about China's human rights abuses, trade practices, intellectual property, and interest in the Arctic yet again. What do you think needs to happen in order to ease tensions between the US and Canada, specifically in order to find alignment in foreign and defense policy towards China that is in our nation's mutual best interest?
First off, just let me say how extremely disappointed and concerned Canada is with the arbitrary detention of we call the two Michaels. You know, this is national behavior and conduct which is unacceptable, and we have demanded their release from this arbitrary detention. These men have done nothing wrong. It was in retaliation for actions that Canada legally took based on a treaty it has with the United States. So we've called for their immediate release. In addition, we've called for clemency for another Canadian, Robert Schellenberg, who's facing the death penalty in China, which we don't believe is warranted in any way. And the Canadian government has this as its number one policy issue with China. I would also like to say and express here our gratitude to the United States, because at every opportunity, the United States Secretary of State, presidents have raised the issue of the two imprisoned Canadians with Chinese officials, and have also demanded their release on behalf of Canada. So we greatly appreciate that. You know, I think, again, when you look back, I think we all, from an international perspective, thought when China was emerging, you know, it was going to join the World Trade Organization, it was going to follow the global rules. Yes, it's going to have rough spots in its development, but you know, we were ready to accept that. And it's turned out, in my personal view, to be a very different kind of China than we thought we were getting. They continue to hack large amounts of data from us. They are studying us, certainly. They're collecting data on us, and you need massive amounts of data in order to refine artificial intelligence programs. So just my personal belief, I don't have any data evidence on this, but I often wonder if this is why these great hacks of health records and banking records and all of these things are happening. And I think we need to be prepared for the fact that this could all be used against us in the future. Again, that's my personal view. But the tensions that we certainly have on the economic side, the theft of intellectual property, it's constant. It's a daily event, and it's difficult to do business with partners or people who purport to be your partners who are actually robbing you blind of critical information and technological information. So I think from a Canada-US perspective, we have to get all the nations to continue to press China to, I know it's cliche, but to play by the rules and to demonstrate what the consequences will be if they don't. I'm not an economist, so you know I'm not in the policy world. I can't tell you what those consequences might be over and above what we might imagine in terms of sanctions and things like that. But we can't continue, in my personal view, on the road that we're on in this relationship with China. High tension, yet everyone wants to trade. Well, at one point, how can that possibly be reconciled together? And it's a bit of a tricky, not tricky, it's a very different problem than we had with the Soviet Union, because we didn't trade with the Soviet Union to the same extent. We don't trade with Russia to the same extent. The example I always use is if you go to a Walmart, how many products do you find in Walmart made in Russia? How many do you find made in China? And certainly a lot of Canadian and American companies have gotten very rich producing low-cost goods in China and selling them in North America and Europe. So a complicating factor in the relationship perhaps needs to be dealt with. But I think Canada and the United States have stood side by side on this issue of China's behavior on the world stage from the economic perspective, but also with regard to the two Michaels. I mean, this is conduct that we don't expect from an advanced nation. It's in my view, just my view personally, it's clumsy, it's amateurish, and I don't believe it's going to achieve what the Chinese think it's going to achieve, and it's frankly deplorable behavior on China's part.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes here to go to audience questions, and I've got a couple I want to make sure that we get to, and they build on some of these economic ties in trade. Now, knowing you're not a trade specialist and an economic specialist, I'll pitch them to you and take them at your comfort level. The first one is from Gordon, and he asks about, he said, trade rather than defense. In recent years, the U.S. has made a big point of the trade deficit, how the U.S. trade deficit is suffering, and only by certain measurements with Canada. And we know trade and trade deficits also play a big role in bilateral relations in defense and security. Gordon says, as a young Canadian growing up in Montreal, am I correct in remembering that Canada ran a constant and long-lasting trade deficit with the U.S.? And if that is the case, then isn't this current deficit fair play and perhaps not something to be overly concerned about?
Well, Gordon, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. And again, I'll do my best to tell you what I know, and perhaps our Consul General might be able to jump in and answer some of the question. But I would say, yes, Guar, thanks for jumping in there. I heard recently that Canada is actually running a trade deficit with the United States, and it's not in our benefit, and it hasn't been in our benefit for some time. But decades come and go. Sometimes you're up and sometimes you're down. But I think generally the health of the economic relationship is undeniable. I mean, the goods that we certainly export to the U.S., much of that returns to us as finished goods. So there's value provided on both sides of the board. And, we have a free trade agreement, which has become, you guys call it USMCA, we call it USMA, Canadian-U.S. Mexico agreement. And, and that was a modernizing of the arrangements we had, which frankly benefits all of us. So I'm going to turn over to Guar here, and you can bail me out on this one.
Yeah, thank you. You threw a lifeline to me, and I'm glad to help out, Major General. Look, one of the things that I would talk about is the concept of free and fair trade, and trade between Canada and the United States is free and fair. Our labor standards are clear, our environmental standards are clear, the way that we treat contracts, respect for rule of law, all of those things provide a clear framework. The trade is basically, it's dollar for dollar. I mean, you're looking at a trading relationship which is about 700 billion, and it's almost split half and half. But what I like to point to is the example of the Cheerios. Cheerios are produced in Iowa. They're made from grains that are produced in Saskatchewan. They come down they're exported down into the United States. They're converted into a finished good, and they come back to Canada, the product. When we produce a car will go back and forth across the border 8 times before it's a final product. That's the nature of an integrated trade relationship. So to look at an abstract, and I apologize to economists in the room, to look at an abstract number like a trade balance is to be unfair to the nature of the relationship. What I can tell you is that we move around the equivalency barrier. And if you're looking at it from a Canadian optic, you might say, well, we seem to export a lot of raw materials and we seem to buy a lot of finished products, and that's not good for us. But we don't look at it like that. We look at companies like the ones I mentioned in Philadelphia, like Aramark, who do investments in Canada, who provide good paying jobs for Canadians. That's what we talk about. And it leads me, Lauren, to the point about, when we see legislation coming down the path on Buy America, that to us doesn't make a whole lot of sense because a lot of those companies are located on both sides of the border and they do things on the basis of efficiency and production. And when you say it has to be produced in Canada, what you're doing is you're distorting the supply chain. So look, just picking up on what the Major General said, and he said it quite correctly. Our trade is free and it's fair and it's legitimate. And we really, really shouldn't get too caught up on those numbers because we're a reliable partner.
Indeed. All right, we've got a question from Abby. I've heard you all mention possible threats in the future, such as hacking and AI. What do you think is the most relevant threat in today's society?
Abby, thanks for the question. In terms of, from a defense perspective, the threat that can hurt us, we look at it in a number of ways. So there are the conventional threats where someone actually strikes you with, say, a missile or something like that, a ballistic missile. And we used to worry about ICBMs in the Cold War, nuclear weapons coming and things like that. I mean, these things are still there. We also talked about the below threshold threat, things that you don't see, things that are so well hidden or operating in the background. It's almost like a parasite, just slowly bleeding you. And you almost don't realize it's there, or it's in such small amounts that it doesn't appear to be significant, but when you agglomerate it all together, you realize how significant it can be. And there's a lot of thinking out there about what is the greatest threat to us at the moment. My personal feeling at the moment is this below threshold threat, where we're constantly hacked, we're constantly having intellectual property stolen from us, and from some of our greatest companies in the world. The Boeings, the Lockheed Martins of the world, the many great Canadian companies as well, as you might be familiar with. And so it's a constant daily defense we're in to protect us and protect ourselves from this. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's just government institutions. It's people like you, Abby. It's people like me. It's people like Lauren. Our personal information is being targeted. Why? Not 100% sure, but it can eventually be used against us somehow. So this is an immediate threat that it's very hard to deal with. We're spending a lot of time working on it, and we're depending on it every day. So we constantly feel we're in conflict, if you want to use that term, in this area. And then, certainly, from a more traditional perspective, nations are developing other weapons that are going to be difficult to deal with. And I mentioned one is hypersonic weapons. So now I'm out of sort of cybersphere and AI to a more traditional weapon. So normally a missile would fly at, say, Mach 2 or 3. Well, these weapons can go up to Mach 25, which is 25 times the speed of sound, makes them very hard to see, very hard to find, and very hard to deal with, to defeat them. So, we're very concerned about these developments as well. Those technologies are being developed. Some of them already exist. And we have to do that calculus all the time. Well, how likely is it they would be used? What is the intent? Just because they exist doesn't always mean there's an intent to use them. So we have to figure that out and then decide where our limited resources go to try and defend against all of these things. And I would just say one final thing. This is why alliances are so important. No one country, not even the United States, has the resources to deal with all of these threats all at once. A, it's just too expensive to do it. And B, so much collaboration is needed to work together to make sure that our interests are protected and things that we think are valuable are protected. So we need the help of England, Germany, and Australia, South Africa, etc. And I would say this is one thing that we have as an advantage that a country like China and Russia don't have. They don't have these large alliances of people who value the same thing and who want, to protect their freedoms and their democracies. And that's an advantage we have to protect as well. So that's a long answer to your question.
A long one, but a good one. Thank you, Major General. At this time, we've got more questions, but we want to respect people's time. So we will wrap up and offer our thanks to you, Major General Ormsby, for sharing this time and your perspective and in-depth analysis with us. The importance of strong allies, like we've talked about tonight, and spending time to strengthen those relationships and not take them for granted feels ever more necessary in a world that feels really divided right now. We're grateful to have this intimate time with you to learn more about that and to inform Philadelphians about what's going on and perhaps about things we could do to help or think about or promote within our own lives and businesses, and maybe come on vacation up to Canada in one of those cabins when the border opens back up. We also thank Consul General Houar Nassim for being with us this evening as well. And of course, thank you to our audience, including members of the World Affairs Council and new friends joining us for the first time tonight. We appreciate our sponsors who make nonpartisan civil programming like this possible to bring the world to Philadelphia and to bring Philadelphia to the world. Please do consider joining us for our upcoming programs, which are all listed on our website. Next week on the 17th, we're hosting a discussion with Pennsylvania Representatives Houlihan and Fitzpatrick. We're both members of the Congressional Problem Solvers Caucus from opposing parties. That's not easy to do, to get people from opposing parties to come to the same program. And we'll discuss the importance of bi-policy solution making in this hyper-partisan era. And you can check out all of our other programs, our international travel opportunities, as well as ways to get your students and kids involved in world affairs, all on our website, wacphila.org. We hope you'll join us again, and we wish you a very good evening. Thank you. Good night.